Joy again.
Hey everybody, I'm Ben Yee.
I'm Elissa Stein. We're here talking about fusion
Balloting and the WFP and what's going on with Andrew Cuomo, Cynthia Nixon, and the constellation of unions, the Working Families Party, and progressives who don't support Andrew Cuomo.
Okay, so this is something I know nothing about, so I'm really excited that you do.
But this has become really big news in the last week.
But I've heard about this, about how the Working Family Party, WFP, supported Cuomo last time.
Yes.
And they sort of were stabbed in the back.
Very much so.
Right. So can you explain a little bit about that before we get into what's going on today?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'm going to explain very briefly is fusion balloting, which I think we might have spoken about tangentially once. But New York has a system called fusion balloting, which is how we do our voting, which used to be very prevalent in the United States, but now is isolated to New York State, and it allows for multiple parties. The way fusion balloting works is multiple parties can endorse the same candidate for the same office. So normally the Democrats run somebody, the Republicans run somebody differently. And if you're the Green Party or the Working Families Party in another place, you would also run your own candidate. But with fusion balloting, the WFP can run the same person as the Democrats.
Oh, I've seen that. So somebody can be listed on the ballot twice?
Correct.
Does it matter?
With two different parties.
Right, so does it matter?
Or three or four different parties.
Right, but so suppose Andrew Cuomo endorsed by Democratic Party, and they're endorsed by Working Families. Not that that's happening this time.
It's not.
It's not, but because they endorsed Cynthia Nixon. But when you vote, does it matter which party you choose?
It does matter, and this is what allows us to have multiple parties in New York. In order to be a legitimate party and have an automatic ballot line, which means that you're entitled to run somebody for office in an election, you need to get 5% of the gubernatorial vote. So if the smaller parties all endorse a major party candidate, say all the liberal parties endorse who the Democrat is, and all of the conservative parties endorse who the Republicans put up, then they're almost guaranteed to make their 5% requirement, because people can still vote for the Republican or Democratic candidate just on a different line. So there's always an effort by the WFP and all these smaller parties to say, don't vote for the Democrat on the Democrat line or the Republican on the Republican line.
So it matters.
Vote on our line so that we maintain our ballot access. And what the ballot access allows them to do then is in all other elections run whoever they want. And they have automatic access to the ballot.
Fascinating. So does it count for, because the last time they ran with Andrew Cuomo on their line, does that count towards this election? So now they automatically have their own line?
Correct. So they automatically have their own line. So one of the big questions, so what ended up happening was, in 2014, Andrew Cuomo ran for governor, and Zephyr Teachout ran against him in the Democratic primary. Now, the WFP is the largest, you might consider it the most influential third party in New York State. And the reason goes back to the founding of the WFP, which is the unions basically decided that they wanted to have a party for working people, hence working families. So the unions have been supporting and lending their influence and, most importantly, their financial resources to the WFP since its founding, which has made it very powerful. Now, in 2014, Zephyr Teachout ran against Andrew Cuomo, and there was a huge division in the WFP as to whether or not they should support the true progressive or support Andrew Cuomo. And there was a big effort by Andrew Cuomo to get the WFP line, and ultimately what ended up happening was Bill de Blasio came in, who had just won his election in 2013 as like the darling progressive, and went around and convinced the WFP, was like, listen, you got to trust me, Andrew Cuomo's a good guy. And he swung the WFP vote for Cuomo. Cuomo then basically immediately turns around, says, I didn't agree to anything the WFP wanted, and forms this new party called the Women's Equality Party. And the Women's Equality Party is ostensibly to be a party that fights for women's issues here in New York. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say that. Gender equity here in New York.
Got it.
But the real reason is when you see WFP and WEP on a ballot, the difference is a single stroke on a letter in the middle. So it was there to confuse people, because they're all going to endorse Andrew Cuomo.
It's like that paying Chad thing.
Exactly. So they all endorsed Andrew Cuomo, so you're like, oh, it was a WEP, WFP, and they kind of look the same.
Right.
So,
whoa, that is really horrible.
Yeah, and also he then can't stand that he was relying on Bill de Blasio and starts. So there's this huge feud between de Blasio and Cuomo, even though de Blasio basically went to the mat for this guy.
Yeah. So is that where it started? Like kind of the really bad feelings between them?
It might also have to do with universal pre-K, but we won't get into it. Okay. There are like other things going on, but the important piece right now is that Andrew Cuomo realized that the WFP probably wasn't going to endorse him, withdrew his name from consideration. And that means that the WFP went and endorsed Cynthia Nixon. And the really critical thing here is, one, that pissed off Andrew Cuomo. And he said that any union that supports an organization that supports Cynthia Nixon can just lose my number. At least that's the report of what he said. So you read that, and what that means is now there's a schism in the unions about whether or not they should be supporting the WFP. So a bunch of unions have jumped ship, which is drastically reducing the power of the WFP.
Wow.
And they've also jumped ship from a bunch of grassroots organizations like Citizen Action and Make the Road New York, which do very important, good grassroots organizing here for like good governance and stuff. And they also did not support Cuomo.
So this is really another fucked up thing that Andrew Cuomo has done to not support a progressive path for New York.
Yes, but more than that, this is one of the more systemic things he's done, which is really shaking up the power balance in New York. The WFP used to be a party that pulled the Democrats to the left because they could run their own candidates and like their endorsement meant something because they had resources that came from unions. And now there's a schism in their main backers, it's causing them a lot of hurt. Now it gets even better. Having endorsed Cynthia Nixon, she's going to be on the WFP line when she, in the gubernatorial election, which
Right.
means that people won't be able to vote for Andrew Cuomo on the WFP line. So people who are who are loyal to the WFP and don't like Andrew Cuomo and want to vote for Cynthia Nixon, all those people could vote for her, which will split the progressive vote. And some people fear that it will hand the election to the Republican.
Right. Well,
Additionally,
but this is only in the primary.
No, that's in the general.
Got it. Okay.
There
So
will-
Cynthia Nixon will be on the ballot
Right.
regardless of what
There's
happens.
no
in Democratic
WFP.
power.
Yes,
Okay.
because there's no WFP line in the primary. But now
Got it.
now that the WFP has not endorsed the Democratic candidate for
Got it. So regardless of the primary, at this point, when primaries matter, everybody go and vote in the primaries. At this point,
Cynthia Nixon will still be running in the primary for the Democratic line.
Right, but regardless of the outcome of that, she will be on the ballot in November. So
And there's only two
regardless
ways
of
to
this
get her
outcome,
off, which is for
she'll
the
drop out.
for the WFP to put her up for a legislative seat or for a judgeship. She can't just rescind it at this
Oh.
point. So
So she's going to have to run for something. It doesn't have to be for governor. Now that she's got their endorsement, she needs to be on the ballot in November.
Right.
It doesn't have to be for the governorship.
but it gets better.
Wow.
If the WFP can't figure that part out, they're not going to have endorsed Andrew Cuomo for governor, which means whether they have no candidate on the line or it's Cynthia Nixon, unless they're dividing the vote, they're not going to get their 5% and they'll be off the
Off the
ballot.
ballot next time. I have to say,
This is big.
First of all, this is huge. This is huge. I've been listening to Cynthia Nixon and listening to what she has to say, and I know that you're not a fan.
No, I like
A
Cynthia Nixon
celebrity-
just fine.
Wait, no, but of a celebrity with no
Oh, well,
experience.
generally speaking.
Right, but
I mean, I'm not a fan of Cuomo. I don't know if that came across.
But I think that I understand what she's saying, and I understand her point of view, and she does have progressive viewpoints, and she has been an advocate for education for 20 years, and she has been more involved certainly than I realized. And I think that Cuomo has stabbed so many people in the back for such a long time and is so untrustworthy and has done such dirty deals in Albany and has really kept things at a standstill that maybe people need to shake things up.
We can talk about the history of
Cynthia Nixon,
Andrew
come and
Cuomo
talk
and
to
all
us and
this
tell
stuff.
tell us why you should be governor. We would love to have you.
And we can go really down the rabbit hole on that. But
Yeah.
the important point that I want to make in this segment was just there is a real shakeup of
Yeah.
the power balance happening in New York right now. And what happens there is going to determine how much influence progressives and left of center people really have in the near future and like what happens with our multi-party system.
So I'm just going to close with this because this was fascinating. But I felt very much during the Constitutional Convention conversations that unions had a huge say, and they didn't want it.
Right.
But it was one of the times where I thought unions in New York were very powerful. They were the ones who ran the ads. They were ones out speaking at meetings.
Yeah.
It was a powerful force.
Yeah.
But if they're now being split, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
And that's the
Yeah.
important point. if the unions get split, it's going. It is
Right, because they were a force,
Yeah.
and I saw it, in full effect.
They will
this
always
past-
have some aligned interests, but actually there was a report that 3 of the largest unions might be thinking about starting their own new party to support Governor Cuomo
Aye.
in contravention of the WFP's efforts, which is supposedly the union party. So, interesting stuff.
Interesting stuff, fascinating.
We'll have to
stuff.
revisit over time. We'll have to
Absolutely.
report on where
There's
this
so,
goes.
2018, there's so much to talk about because it's a big election year and we all know that we need to go vote. So the things behind the whys we should go vote
Yeah.
are things we'll be talking about.
And don't forget, April 24th, special elections in several assembly districts and in 2 state Senate districts if you live outside of New York City.
See you next time.
Laters.